Ludmilla stepped forward, casting her gaze up at the crowd above. "I am Baroness Ludmilla Zaradnik, noble of the Sorceress Kingdom. By the arrival of winter, these lands, the entirety of the upper reaches and its encompassing ranges, will come under my jurisdiction. Amongst the undead accompanying me are a few that you must recognize. They are the same as those in the army that swept away the invaders from the west. And now you bring death here." At the goblin crone's accusatory tone, the demi-humans above tensed, clutching their bows and spears and axes. "It is not death that I bring," Ludmilla said quietly, projecting her voice over the crowd, "but an invitation. I am not here to steal your lands and drive you away, but to welcome you to our great nation. The Sorceress Kingdom is not a human country, but one where all races are welcome to prosper under its dominion. As citizens, you will receive the grace and protection of His Majesty the Sorcerer King, Ainzul Gaon." "Name too long." The large troll bellowed. "Long. Weak. Cowardly. How long name protect?" Ludmilla narrowed her eyes, glaive appearing in hand. Behind her, the Death Knights and Death Warriors raised their blades. Screeches of panic filled the air. Some demi-humans bolted back into their holes. Many others cowered where they were. "Stupid PFOT. The goblin crone all but shrieked, "You not see death below? Goblin die, all die. How is weak? If join, what do?" Everyone turned their heads to the ogre sorcerer. "If join, what do?" He repeated, "Join tribe? Ainzul Gaon, new chief?" "For the time being," Ludmilla said, "most things will remain as they have in generations past. The tribes will continue to answer to their respective chiefs, and how your leaders are chosen will also remain the same. Great tribes like the Sun Rock tribe are also fine. The highest chiefs will answer to my administration. Many things will be new to you, but you may take your time getting used to them. Most importantly, you must follow the rules that apply to this territory." "What rules?" "There are many, but I don't think that introducing them all at once would be prudent." The majority of the Sorceress Kingdom's laws were still those of Riestais, while a few additional ones had been enacted to accommodate the realities of a multiracial nation. These newer laws would be simple to adopt, but the remainder revolved around human society and more structured forms of sedentary civilization. "To begin with," she said, "raiding fellow citizens for food, equipment and slaves is prohibited. Theft is punishable according to the law, and slavery is illegal." "Then how eat?" the crone asked. "With the events of the summer," Ludmilla answered, "there should be plenty of territory and game available." "No." The crone frowned. "How eat after? Troll eat goblin. Ogre eat goblin. Everything eat goblin. If no eat goblin, goblin eat everything. All starve." The old crone appeared to be firmly grounded in practical wisdom, enough to ask one of the hardest questions right away. Goblins were a fecund species. If nothing kept their population under control, overpopulation would become an issue. In fact, it was an issue for every race in the Sorceress Kingdom. With food and safety well in hand, all populations within the nation would only grow. The Duchy of Irantal was relatively small. What would happen when they ran out of room? The normal course of action was either migration or war. Excess populations would leave to find unclaimed lands to settle, or they would force others to vacate theirs. This behavior did not just apply to demi-humans, but all living things. Thus far, the royal court had not broached the topic. The Sorceress Kingdom's policies were also those of a benign and orderly nation, so their options for preemptive expansion were limited. Within 2 centuries, they would be facing a population crisis and the neighboring nations would be well aware of it. By then, Ludmilla thought that the empire would be receptive to demi-human migration, but it was merely delaying the ultimate issue. With its current policies, the Sorceress Kingdom's prosperity would inevitably lead to unsustainable populations, even if they unified the entire world. "Do you mean to say that goblins are all right with being eaten?" "No." The crone frowned. "No. But eat, must. No eat, bad." Ludmilla scanned the teeming mass of goblins above. They did not appear to disagree with the crone's statement, but neither were they particularly pleased about it. It was simply a fact of goblin life. She had an inkling that their harsh reality could be softened somewhat once the tribes of the upper reaches started to participate in the local economy. This, however, did not provide an answer to the problem of overpopulation. Finding a true answer seemed beyond anyone's imagination, or rather, The true answer already existed, but was not in line with the regular laws of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. If your people understand its necessity, Ludmilla said, then I can create a bylaw, a special rule, so that you may maintain the relationship between your peoples. However, you are still prohibited from raiding those that lie outside of this special dispensation. This includes raiding other nations. Slavery will also remain illegal. And if attack? The ogre sorcerer asked. How then? Cloudstalkers come, cannot fight? Just to be certain, Ludmilla replied, these Cloudstalkers are field beastmen about twice my height. Several dozen heads nodded in response. In that case, she smiled slightly, I will inform them that you have become my subjects, that is if you intend on becoming my subjects. You, Cloudstalker chief? I do not think they have chiefs. They do answer to me, however, the Kronos came to join me in the spring. A dull murmur filled the air. PFOT shifted his bulk and scowled down at her. And if death worshippers come? Killing and burning? Has something like that happened recently? In summer, the goblin crone said. After great battle. Many come, fleeing. Tell of death worshippers from the south. Many humans. Bright weapons. Bright magics. Bright beings fall from sky. All tribes across mountains killed and burned. Ludmilla frowned at the account, and the memory of the tongue-tied bow and affable Sid came to mind. The two scripture members had come in advance of a theocracy army that had been dispatched to stop the goblin army in the upper reaches. It appeared that they hadn't simply turned around to go home, they instead diverted to clean out the forests to the south of the upper reaches. PFOT was, in essence, asking if she would fight for them even if the attackers were humans-death worshippers who shared the same faith. She looked up at the massive troll, holding his gaze with her own. If any foreign power infringes upon my territory with belligerent intent, she said, I will of course be obliged to answer in kind. It does not matter who they are. The three demi-human leaders exchanged glances with one another, then looked down at her as one. Done, the ogre sorcerer said. Done, said the goblin crone. Done, grunted PFOT. Sunrock tribe follow you, Ludmilla Zaradnik, the old crone said. We join the sorceress kingdom of Ainzulgaon. After accepting their oaths of fealty, Ludmilla gave the Sunrock tribe until spring to spread the word of their new status as subjects of the sorceress kingdom. Despite the dangers inherent to life in the wilderness, events and information flowed slowly when existential threats to the entirety of the upper reaches weren't afoot. This slowness did not bother Ludmilla in the slightest, as she knew winter to be a slow season in general and she was in no hurry to force change. It would probably drive the elder liches of the administration crazy, however. Ludmilla ordered the elder lich sergeant to bring its squadron to the construction camp to stand by for further orders, then flew up the barrier range to update the Kronos rangers there on the status of the territories below. Looking over the upper reaches to the west, she mulled over what she would do next. Bringing the Sunrock tribe under her had effectively taken care of a third of the Highland Basin, advancing her personal schedule ahead by nearly 2 months. The remainder of the upper reaches would be sparsely populated due to the advance of the goblin army, but news of refugees coming from the south meant that there would be more than expected. She wasn't sure if the royal army's reputation had spread to these newly arrived demi-humans, but perhaps the promise of security would be enough to convince them to throw in their lot with the sorcerer's kingdom. She arrived back at the construction camp early in the morning. Most of the workers were already out and about, and the aromas of a hearty breakfast filled the air. Significant progress had been made in the past 3 days, with the workers' longhouse approaching completion. The beginnings of warehouses had started to appear, and a miniature palisade had been raised around the alchemist's workstation for some reason. Ludmilla poked her head inside, finding Pam watching over an array of alchemical equipment with a bowl of hot stew in hand. Good morning, Pam. The apprentice alchemist started, placing her breakfast on the table before performing a rough curtsy. Lady Zaradnik, she said. Good morning. I will not get angry at you for eating breakfast during breakfast, you know. You won't? I have to wonder what makes you think that I would. Pam picked up her bowl again, absently stirring it with a crust of bread. I don't know what to think, my lady. She looked down at her food. I'm just a girl from the city, an orphan that had to grow up in the old slums. Nobles were always 3 whole worlds away. I definitely never imagined I'd be able to speak with one like this. You even remembered my name. The most I ever thought I would get was a "you, girl," or something like that. Or is that really what comes to mind when people think about nobles? Probably. Back before the Sorceress Kingdom, a lot of the nobles that owned manors in the city were like that. Not that I blame them, nobles have their own things to do. Remembering every little person in Urantal isn't one of them. Ludmilla supposed that it was still that way. She certainly didn't have the time or inclination to get the name background of every person that she passed in the street, but addressing people so rudely was not something she would do. Pam appeared to take her silence a bit too seriously. That might be for those city nobles, yeah? It's not as if commoners like us don't have strange ideas as well. More than once I had some silly dream about becoming the favorite of some aristocrat and living an easy life for a few years. After that, I'd use the connections I made to get a better job than carrying heavy crates back and forth all day. Not that I'm pretty enough for that. Just something poor girls in the city sometimes hope for. Everyone uses everyone, you know? Ludmilla eyed the apprentice's necklace. A crystal pendant hung off of it, as did an emblem of Sursana. Perhaps she was a member of the faithful recently returned to the fold. Followers of the Six were usually more mindful of who they shared themselves with. Beyond that, Pam was 3 or 4 years younger than Ludmilla, which meant she was not yet considered an adult. Then again, her life in the city was probably much harder than what those in rural areas experienced. Tenant agreements included enough land to support a household, though poor harvests or fluctuating prices for commodities affected everyone. Since spares of tenant families who did not require extra hands were usually sent out into the world upon reaching adulthood, which was around 14 for followers of the Four, food and shelter were not problems for most households in a normal situation. Those who ended up in urban centers faced an uphill battle for survival. Orphans, spares, and those who migrated to try their luck in what they thought was a place of opportunity quickly discovered how hard it was to tap into the flows of wealth that coursed through a city or town's streets. Shops only required so many apprentices, temples could only support so many acolytes, the wealthy only needed so many servants. Adventurers usually met some grim fate before reaching silver rank. More often than not, a life of menial labor awaited the unestablished. It was not difficult to imagine why one would consider shortcuts that they would not have if their lot in life had been better. I hope that you will treat yourself more preciously from now on, Ludmilla told her. Becoming an alchemist's apprentice is quite a step up from transporting crates. It was just luck, I think. Pam turned her gaze downwards. I ran into some ridiculously pretty girl in the spring that could move things around like it was nothing. She helped me out for a day and that put me ahead enough to see if I could learn magic. I started figuring things out just in time for Miss Linez to snap me up and whisk me off to Warden's Vale. It was not only luck, Ludmilla said. If you did not have the capacity for magic in the first place, no amount of happenstance would have landed you in your current position. As a follower of the Six, you are not some insignificant orphan, you are an individual blessed with a valuable bloodline. Your future family will not have to live in the slums and struggle to survive. Ludmilla left the apprentice to her breakfast, going around the camp to inspect its progress. Watching the workers go back and forth, she wondered how many had the capacity for magic. She still received dubious looks from her atelier staff when it came to the proposed ratio of magic casters in her domain. Due to multiple factors, Riastais had a critically low number of magic casters, so the idea that they were rare had become normal thinking to the magical community. But how many people were like Pam, who was once in a situation where she could not explore her potential? How many never considered magic in the first place? According to the knowledge of the local caster community, there were actually many magic casters who were not professionals. They did not pursue magical vocations or register at the Magician Guild. These non-professional magic casters treated magic as a supplemental skill set that improved their daily lives and the lives of those around them. A few questions posed to the various tenants that had migrated to the Vale showed this to be the case. There were people who used magic to improve food quality. They conjured spices, paper and other commodities that were hard to access in a farming village. If you had a particularly stubborn stain, a clean spell was just a few doors away. A tub of cold well water became a warm bath with a wave of a hand. Warden's Vale had Bohadan and Sophia, who saw to all of its needs, so Ludmilla had never put much thought into increasing the village's magic caster population in the past. It was said that a professional magic caster with no particular aptitude could still eventually learn second-tier magic. With level 15 being what the average person was limited to in their lives, it was easy to see why that was. Professional magic casters lived fairly comfortable lives, which meant that they had the financial leeway to pursue side interests and hobbies. Third-tier magic required 15 job class levels associated with the type of caster one was, so picking up even a single job class level related to an unassociated side interest or hobby meant that one would become stuck as second-tier casters. First-tier magic was also a saturated market, so those who did not have wealthy patrons or apprenticeships would take side jobs to further their studies, exposing them to the risk of picking up multiple build-contaminating job class levels. To Ludmilla, this suggested that her institutionalized approach to raising magic casters had a fair chance at attaining the desired demographics. Those who qualified to become professionals would receive the support that they needed to become third-tier practitioners. Once individuals with aptitude were identified and caster bloodlines were cultivated, a decently sized population of fourth-tier magic casters was not implausible. It was not something that would happen in a handful of generations, but with a limitless lifespan and access to resurrection magic, she could ensure that this vision became a reality in the millennia to come. "We have some new friends, I. The camp overseer looked up from its paperwork. "Your objective was to incorporate the denizens of this territory as new subjects. Friends does not indicate subjugation. Subjugation has various negative connotations," Ludmilla said, "none of which can be detected in the process that led to their admission as citizens of the Sorcerer's Kingdom." Ludmilla reached into her infinite haversack, producing a strip of salted venison. As an undead being, she did not need to eat and did not experience hunger, but the aromas of breakfast still gave her an appetite for food. Many mindless undead displayed hunger, such as ghouls and ghasts for flesh and incorporeal undead for life energy. In her experience, however, the only other type of intelligent undead that displayed anything like the needs of living things were vampires. Lady Shiltier's appetite for Ludmilla grew as they spent time together, which occasionally led to her liege sating her hunger. Vampires had a well-known reputation for feeding on blood and were often associated with the more carnal aspects of human nature, so Lady Shiltier's needs were easy to understand and natural for her race. Of revenants, however, Ludmilla knew little beyond what His Majesty and Lady Shiltier had shared with her. The only clear compulsion that some appeared to possess was the pursuit of vengeance, which the Sorcerer King had inquired about several times. She felt no such thing, however. It never felt like she was being compelled to do anything. She certainly wasn't being compelled to nibble on a strip of jerky. The only thing that she could think that caused this appetite was based on what Elishnish had shared, that her existence was the manifestation of a concept. Since her human self appeared to be one of the core elements of that concept, she displayed many human traits and behaviors. As things were, Ludmilla never grew hungry from not eating, but the things that should have tempted her appetite as a human did. The results of this process appear to have pleased you. Ludmilla took the strip of meat out of her mouth, waggling it as she spoke. "I do not see why I should not be pleased," she said. "The outcome was beyond optimal." "Beyond optimal?" I leaned forward slightly. "Describe this process." "It is not a process we can easily replicate," Ludmilla said. "You may as well consider it a product of chance." "But if it can be replicated," I said, "our outcomes will always be beyond optimal." Ludmilla smiled at the elder leech's intense interest, taking another bite out of her jerky. She idly gazed out over the camp, wondering where to begin. "I suppose that I should preface this by describing the results if the preceding events had not occurred," she said. "Generally speaking, negotiating with a demi-human tribe involves a formula that factors in relative strength, the behaviors of each species, and how one leverages their position. If a human noble walks into the camp of even a small demi-human tribe with a Death Knight in tow, you will not only have their reaction to the presence of a human, but the universal reaction to the undead. Things become messy past that point. It would probably result in several dead demi-humans, an injured or dead human noble, and the survivors fleeing in every direction while the Death Knight and its squire zombies try to kill as many of the aggressors as they can before losing track of the rest. And this was the expectation for your efforts? No, but it is how the basic formula would play out with those variables. I changed the variables, namely removing the Death Knight, and went alone. I am not the same as an average human, and I have the luxury to allow demi-human perceptions to align with reality. Once reality sunk in, I would be in a position to communicate properly with them. If anyone sought to challenge me in an attempt to deny reality, then forcefully correcting their perceptions would be required. After that would be the slow process of integration into the Sorcerer's Kingdom. This was the original expectation for my interactions with the local demi-human tribes. Isoriai's pen scratched over his notepad. Ludmilla was tempted to come around and take a look at what was being written, but he finished writing and raised his head again. How was the obtained result beyond optimal? The demi-humans in the eastern third of the upper reaches are all under the influence of a single great tribe, the Sunrock tribe. I was able to meet with their leaders, who willingly submitted to my rule without a fight. Word will travel slowly, but a third of our subjugation work has been effectively accomplished through nothing more than this single meeting. I do not recognize any substantial difference in efficiency compared to subjugating this Sunrock tribe with direct force. The difference lies in how we have been spared any need for doing such things and what it means for future integration, Ludmilla told him. The denizens of the upper reaches were decimated this summer by the invading goblin army. Due to this, food and land are plentiful and their territorial tendencies have been blunted. In other words, they are in a collective frame of mind where recovery from a disaster is prioritized over aggression. They also know that the ones who destroyed the goblin army saved them from destruction in turn. More importantly, they understand the impossible difference in strength between the royal army and themselves. If that were not already enough, the theocracy forces that turned around once they found out they had nothing to do in the upper reaches instead diverted to clear out their side of the mountains, creating a tide of refugees that reinforced the notion that enemies still lay to the south. So they have been made to believe that they are in a hopeless situation, I said, and the Sorcerer's Kingdom is their only recourse. Ludmilla frowned at Isoriai's summary. I would not exactly express what happened in those terms. Saying that they were made to believe their situation also suggests that the entire cascade of events since last winter was the result of some grand machination with impossibly precise results. I believe that we can replicate the process. The elder leech's voice turned thoughtful. I will submit my report with a recommendation that this method is employed elsewhere. I would recommend against making that recommendation, Ludmilla told Isoriai. The Sorcerer's Kingdom should not rely on such duplicitous methods. Our national prestige would suffer incalculable damage if it was discovered that we employed such underhanded schemes against civilian populations without just cause. The rest of the morning was spent going over procedures for receiving any demi-human visitors to the camp, as well as how the local security forces would act around them. She didn't think that any curious or brave tribespeople would appear for months yet, but the exercise planted the seeds for many other considerations meriting thought before the coming of spring. Though she had a sense that the upper reaches would not resemble any human territory of the Sorcerer's Kingdom, the realizations that had come with the past week clearly defined the differences. Only the lands along the roads in the central fort would match Warden's Vale in terms of development. The rest would likely remain the savage wildlands nested in overactive human imaginations. Even undeveloped, the territory still had natural resources. It was in these resources she put her hopes into when it came to economic integration. All sorts of things could be foraged that had value in the rest of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. There were even luxury commodities like perfumes and precious ores. Over the years, the locals would learn how to trade for manufactured goods like tools and fabrics. With trade would flow not just wealth, but ideas and information. It was possible that the process would take generations, but as long as connections were maintained, the denizens of the upper reaches would form a distinct culture that contributed to the greater culture of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Rather than forcing compliance, she felt that this more natural process would result in fewer problems in the long run. An odd feeling fell over her as her busy schedule unexpectedly unbusied itself. She was prepared to tromp around the eastern basin for the next 2 months, trying to establish order over the tribes. Bringing the Sunrock tribe under her made that unnecessary. Reconnaissance and cartography by the Royal Army were as much for her administration's benefit as it was a training exercise, so she was loath to change what they were doing. Additionally, her review of the Lynham Sisters' patrol and security arrangements found that they were already making the best use of available resources. I should check on Ilishnish's place. Despite her desire to travel, the Frost Dragon constantly worried about her lair. Ludmilla made the long ascent to the peak that loomed over the Katza River Valley. The heights of Mount Verilyn had been refashioned by Lord Mayor while Ludmilla was out in the Katza Plains. Its highest peaks had been linked and reshaped to form a north-facing bowl containing a lake roughly 6 kilometers long and 3 kilometers wide. The lake and the bowl were not visible from the surroundings below. Ludmilla hadn't yet seen the frost dragon's home, so she was growing curious about what it looked like. Though the floor of the river valley was rarely cold enough to freeze, snow and ice were already collecting in the shadows of Mount Verulin's heights. According to the frost dragon, her home would remain frozen even during the height of summer, so a snow-capped massif complete with glaciers would become a permanent part of the local scenery. When Ludmilla asked why that was, Elishnish only looked at her as if she was some sort of idiot. Ludmilla flew over the lake, peering into its crystal-clear waters. The entrance to Elishnish's lair was supposed to be in the depths of the lake's southern end, but she couldn't see it from above. She glanced around before unequipping her outfit and dropping into the lake with a light splash. Gooseflesh formed over her skin in reaction to the icy water. Yet, at the same time, the cold had no true effect on her being. After sinking nearly 100 meters, she finally spotted a cavern entrance. It took her over 15 minutes to find her way out of the maze-like tunnels. Her head broke the surface of another lake inside the peak, or did it count as the same lake? The ceiling stretched high above, and the entire cavern was coated in a thick layer of ice. 500 meters away, a frozen island floated in the water. Is that an iceberg? Ludmilla swam over. Once she crawled up onto the ice and rose to her feet, she shook herself off as best as she could. It occurred to her that she was running around naked in someone else's home, save for her belt and the containers hanging upon it. Her small clothes and boots came on a moment later. Her gaze wandered everywhere as she made her way around. It was not really comparable to anything. The only thing that came to mind was that it was a dragon-sized home. While they were supposedly the smallest of true dragons, frost dragons were still dragons. According to Elishnish, a fully developed ancient frost dragon would be 30 meters in length. The icy abode before her appeared to be fashioned for that eventuality. Tunnels were burrowed through the ice, leading to dozens of large chambers. All of them were devoid of any content. After going up and down for a while, she found herself entering a large inner chamber. It was carved out at water level, forming a sort of moat around a central island. An island in a lake in an island in a lake in a mountain, only accessible from a lake on top of a mountain. Did all dragons have such well-hidden lairs? Why was Elishnish constantly worried about her home when it was so inaccessible? She doubted that anyone would know it was here if not for the conspicuous presence of ice on the mountain. Even if they managed to locate the entrance, most would simply freeze or drown trying to make it in. She unequipped her small clothes again and swam over to the core of her companion's lair. A small pile of platinum coins occupied the exact center. Several small bookshelves were arranged around it, half filled with books. A desk with a chair sat between two of the bookshelves, and a couch with a blanket was placed across the pile of coins from it. Ludmilla had no idea what a frost dragon needed a blanket for. Elishnish, is there anything you wanted me to check on in your lair? Several minutes passed without a response. Elishnish. Ludmilla considered nudging the presence in the corner of her mind, but she wasn't sure what that would do. It was mid-afternoon, so chances were that she was on the road. All Ludmilla could discern, however, was that she was stressed and anxious, which she supposed was no different than before. Maybe she was simply too far for coherent communication. She would have to ask Lady Aura about it at some point. She made one more round through the dragon's lair before swimming back out again. Floating above the water, she dried her hair before descending to the harbor. With the construction crews out in the upper reaches, a sleepy sort of feeling had settled over her capital. Ludmilla took comfort in the familiar sensation. Though much had changed, the sense of slowness that settled over the Vale as winter approached had not. Death Knights stood at their posts and patrolled the harbor front. 3 Soul Eaters patiently waited for work with their wagons. The only sign of activity beyond that was in the harbor master's office. She walked over and poked her head inside. Jeeves? Welcome, Lady Zaradnik. The skeleton merchant greeted her with a bright voice and an elegant bow. Standing behind his desk surrounded by shelves and filing cabinets, he appeared to be much busier than the sight of the empty harbor suggested. Did something happen? No, just going through old records, he replied. I received a report from one of the ladies with the Ministry of Transportation about a new fellow coming in to ply the route between Warden's Vale and Corlin Harbor. His vessel has some interesting dimensions, and I was trying to figure out how much cargo he could handle. Captain Iska is an independent trader, Ludmilla told him, so we cannot treat Ruin's Wake as we do our own ship. We will have to wait until he loads his purchases before hiring the remainder of his cargo capacity for our shipments. Of course, my lady, of course. Still, this will be quite the boon. That much was true. The trusty old Nar of Warden's Vale endlessly went back and forth from Corlin Harbour, yet Ludmilla's warehouses and cargo lots continued to fill. Hiring another ship was better than leaving goods unsold for seasons on end. The completion of the roads and restoration of the bridge to the interior would also alleviate matters, but, as usual, there was too much work and not enough labor. The first few rounds of Ruin's Wake should be as a chartered cargo vessel, Ludmilla said. How quickly will we be able to empty the warehouses? Lady Corlin has a seemingly bottomless appetite for timber and stone, so I doubt there will be any problems receiving the increased volume. As much as could be expected for a vessel of that size, but it's strange, the projected loading time is a serious impediment. According to the Ministry's information, it should take 4 or 5 hours to fully unload and load Ruin's Wake. It takes about a day for her to go from Warden's Vale to Corlin Harbour, so it's quite the chunk of time. It was a problem identified by her friends even before Solitas saw wider implementation in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. Cargo took time to load, and a vehicle that wasn't on the move was simply a highly inefficient warehouse. This loading time took up a larger percentage of a route's schedule as transportation became faster. A freight wagon took an hour to unload, load, and secure. That same wagon could take a Solita less than an hour to deliver its goods from village to town. With infrastructure being improved and Solita-drawn wagons becoming increasingly common, so too were the delays caused by cargo transfers. Unless it was one of the newly built cargo hubs like Corlin Harbour, towns and even the city of Erantle ended up with long lines of wagons on the roads. According to Clara, Lady Shiltier had already provided them with a solution, leaving its implementation to Clara, Leanne, and Florine. Supposedly, it was something that would revolutionize transport, and the design of recently built harbour and warehouse areas, including those in Warden's Vale, had something to do with it. As long as the expansion of the harbour district can keep up with our exports, Ludmilla said, we should be fine. This issue may not be with us for much longer. Speaking of keeping up, I believe we need to open another warehouse for alchemical reagents. Yes, that's right, Jeeves nodded. Those trainees of yours are quite industrious. That is a good thing, Ludmilla smirked. They need to be ready for formal training in the spring. The trainees Jeeves was referring to were the children that Ludmilla had handpicked to be raised as the first class in the next generation of the territory's rangers. Those whose lineages were recorded in the temple records were surprisingly easy to identify. Those without she had to meet with and create new records for. She had gone through many hours of family tales in order to do so, with many of them dubious in the retelling. Since the children were still schooling in their respective villages, she had assigned to them the tasks that she herself had been instructed in at the same age. Survival skills were part and parcel of being a ranger, so it was Ludmilla's hope that the children would gain their first ranger level by having them go out into the secure parts of the Vale to practice every day. While she had spent more of her time on administrative tasks than ranger-related ones, Ludmilla thought that this would be well within the realm of plausibility. According to Alessia, acolytes and squires in the theocracy started their training between the ages of 6 and 8. Have there been any issues with spoilage or vermin? The new warehouses appear to be keeping well, Jeeves reported. Quality of storage is not a problem, just the dwindling amount of remaining space. Once this Captain Iska starts his route, we should see a slowdown of this, if not a small reversal. You have really taken well to your new post. You flatter me, my lady. In truth, it's essentially the same work as before. There's just far more of it, which I am grateful for. The other Jeeves would have surely been happy as well. The thought of his loss still angered her, but at the same time, the Jeeves before her wouldn't have been born if the old Jeeves had not perished. Well, let me know if there is anything you would like, Ludmilla said. I still feel like I should be compensating you for your work in some way. As usual, the diminutive skeleton merchant scoffed at the notion. Perish the thought, my lady. You are my summoner, so simply being of use to you brings me joy. Her experiences with both Jeeves had taught her much about the nature of created beings. This, in turn, helped her greatly in understanding His Majesty's undead servitors. Still, she sometimes wondered if the Sorcerer King ever had the same thoughts about compensation. After reviewing the rest of the harbor's upcoming matters, she hopped onto one of the waiting wagons, if only to give the Soul Eater something to do. Upon entering the town and opening the door to her temporary residence, she found nearly a dozen elder liches standing around her makeshift hall. "Why are you all down here?" Ludmilla asked. The elder liches exchanged glances before one of them came forward. Its words rolled out in grim tones. "Commander Willuvian's affliction has advanced into its terminal stages." Ludmilla paced up the stairs, a hand going to the infinite haversack at her right hip. It came back down again as she took a deep breath. Preparations have been readied for weeks. Willuvian has everything that she needs. Upon reaching the second-floor landing, the door to the war room opened. One of the locals who had made herself available as a midwife stepped out. Rowena Kemble was a mother of two, a tidy-looking woman in her mid-20s. She wore the smock and kirtle common to rural villagers, dyed in vibrant autumn colors. Behind her came one of Ludmilla's Death Knight footmen, carrying a basin with used towels and empty potion bottles. The midwife only seemed to notice her several steps out of the chamber. She stopped to dip in a slight curtsy. "My lady." "How is everything going, Mrs. Kemble?" Ludmilla asked. "Miss Lynham is resting with her baby inside," Miss Kemble replied. "We were well prepared in advance, so things went quite smoothly. Well, except for those elder liches. They kept crowding in to watch, so I chased them out." Behind her, the Death Knight footman shook its head and seemed to sigh. Ludmilla wasn't sure if it did so because the elder liches had gotten in the way or the fact that a village midwife had chased away enough elder liches to destroy a decently sized country. After some consideration, she decided it was the former. In their particular situation, the midwife was the expert in charge, so they ended up deferring to her the same way that they would listen to a ranger serving as a tracker or a woodcutter clearing the overgrown roads. Authority and hierarchy stood above all else in the Sorceress Kingdom. Personal strength and station only mattered where it was supposed to matter. "How long did it take?" "About 5 hours, my lady. Turned into a bigger deal than it should have been." The elder liches were all confused because they weren't familiarized with the procedures. The Death Knights were the only ones that kept their heads. Shouldn't have been a surprise since they've always had that reliable feeling about them. "The baby was born about an hour ago, a boy, by the way, but I stuck around to make sure that nothing happened after." "Is Luluvian inside as well?" The midwife snorted. "No. She snored right through the whole thing. Makes you wonder what these sisters are made of." Ludmilla glanced towards the Lynham sisters' bedroom door. They had moved into the manor as their delivery dates drew closer, but since they always worked their shifts, the half-elves were probably long accustomed to ignoring disturbances while they rested. "Maybe Willuvian will sleep straight through Luluvian's labor, as well," Ludmilla smirked. "Thank you so much for making yourself available for this, Mrs. Kemble." "An honor to serve, my lady." Rowena Kemble bobbed her head. "Always a joy to see more children around. Gotta fill up our city, eh?" With that, the midwife went down the stairs and out of the building. Inside the war room, Willuvian was sound asleep on one of the couches with her newborn cradled in her arms. Ludmilla smiled down warmly at the mother and child. Though conceived under horrible circumstances, the baby would be raised with proper care and hopefully make his own small mark on the world. She leaned forward, seeing if she could catch a glimpse of the quarter-elves, or whatever they called them, ears, but they were covered by his mother's blanket. Not wanting to cause any further disturbances, she padded out of the room. Back downstairs, Ludmilla glowered at the gaggle of elder liches. "It is not the terminal stage of an affliction," she told them. She was delivering her child. That being said, if the undead servitors harbored values in regards to the living that were similar to those of naturally manifested undead, they might indeed view it as a living blight being spewed forth into the world. His Majesty did not carry those views, however. "Do we have clearance to resume operations?" one of the elder liches asked. "You do," Ludmilla nodded. "But keep in mind that Willuvian is resting in there. Maintain a silence spell over her and do not do anything to disturb them for the next day or so." "Are there any updates to our orders?" "The tribes are settling down for the winter," she said, "so there should be little in the way of new developments. This should also make it easier for us to figure out how many demi-humans there are out there. Continue as you have, Wiluvian should be able to resume her duties by tomorrow. Without any temple staff, it was fortunate that alchemical production was well underway. If not for healing magic or potions, it took months for a woman to fully recover from childbirth. The elder Lich officers filed back up into the war room. Ludmilla went over to the office on the main floor. Within, Nonna appeared to be adding reports to the domain archives. "You could have informed me via message," Ludmilla said. "Childbirth is neither an administrative task nor a military duty," Nonna replied. "Your presence was unnecessary. I recall a certain elder Lich immediately demanding that I run over when Mrs. Milo was having her baby. The process was unfamiliar," the elder Lich said. "It is no longer." Ludmilla suppressed a smirk. Nonna had been very insistent that Ludmilla come over and explain everything that was going on since the people involved were basically ignoring her. Ludmilla and Nonna had been expulsed from the Milo household when the elder Lich started broaching matters of legality and procedure. She walked over to her desk and sorted through the various documents that had piled up over the past few days. Each day's worth was partitioned by Nonna's daily report, and most of what she saw were updates on various aspects of her domain. She picked up the small stack of papers and slowly went through them as she leaned against a wall, making sure nothing was amiss and looking for anything noteworthy. Work on the highway running between the Great Lake and the Dwarf Kingdom had finally been suspended for the winter as the first major storm of the season buried the foothills in 2 meters of snow. The group contracted for the work, as well as the other dwarves working around the Sorceress Kingdom, had returned to their homeland for some sort of religious holiday. They would resume work on the infrastructure in the city later that winter, and construction of the highway would continue in the spring. Next, was a bulletin from the Erantal Festival Committee. As one of the local leaders, Ludmilla was technically a part of the committee but had never attended any of its meetings. It was the sort of thing that civilian nobles loved to spend inordinate amounts of time preparing for, but martial nobles simply threw liquor at. According to her friends, it was perhaps the only time when one would see members of the royal court, the House of Lords, the guild masters and the spiritual leaders of the city in one place. If one were to summarize it in a word, it would be chaos, especially with members of the royal court constantly trying to outdo one another. Ludmilla frowned over the details of the bulletin, which provided updates to the information and timelines of various projects surrounding the first of the nation's new festivals. How many statues? The Sorcerer King Grand Thanksgiving had originally been slated for the autumn harvest, but the size and scope of the affair had grown so much that it had been delayed until the next autumn harvest. At first, it felt like a formalized day to mark the end of the season, something not much different from the local harvest festivals held in every territory. And then, the Prime Minister added the statues. Perhaps spurred on by the appearance of the tribute from the Azalisia Mountains, Prime Minister Albedo had decided to throw in a few statues of her own. According to Clara, Lady Sheltier had taken offense to this blatant and shallow usurpation of others' achievements. It didn't sound like something Lady Sheltier would say, so Ludmilla guessed it was something far more direct and provocative. 95% of the committee had fainted from the overwhelming pressure emanated by the 2 royal courtiers as they verbally sparred against one another. A short recess was called after that. A week later, Lord Cocytus added a parade to be held by the royal army. Lady Sheltier added majestic frost dragon flyovers to the parade and free transportation for those that wanted to come to the city to celebrate His Majesty's Grand Festival. Lady Aura and Lord Mayor threw in riveting entertainment, exciting battles and adventures in the adventurer training area. More and more features were added, and the Harvest Festival went from a single day to 3. At last counting, it would last for 2 weeks. This was not so bad in itself, as the citizens tended to take a sort of break after the harvest anyway, but the most recent bulletin announced the addition of more statues, each over 100 meters tall. One set would be displayed in the city and they were deliberating over where to put the rest. Having a few modest statues was all well and good, except Ludmilla had no idea where in the city they could place multiple statues over 100 meters tall. She set aside the bulletin, praying that they wouldn't tell her to stick one in Warden's Vale. Aside from work associated with her administration, there were also reports from the Ministry of Transportation and the Royal Army. Ludmilla stopped at the bottom of the army reports, finding a correspondence from Lord Cocytus. She unsealed the letter and skimmed through its content before raising it in one hand. "Nonna," she said, "did anything else come with this delivery? Did the bearer have anything to add?" Documents from the Royal Army are personally delivered by military personnel, the elder Lich replied. The civilian administration is not privy to its content, nor did the servitor performing the delivery convey any additional missives. Ludmilla admired the professionalism of the administration's elder Liches, but she still wished that they would be more personable at the same time. Admittedly, it was better than having a clerk that grew too curious for their own good. By all reports, her former nation of Riestais was decidedly not a bastion of administrative professionalism. Additionally, be it under a corrupt official or a well-meaning one, there was always a certain amount of permeability in human-run administrations. Contrary to his brusque manner of speech, Lord Cocytus' handwriting flowed elegantly over the letter's crisp sheets of paper. A bit too elegantly perhaps, it seemed that he used an ink brush rather than a pen. The letter was prefaced by a formal greeting of several sentences before moving on to present its content. The months-long assessment and reorganization of the Baharuth Empire's domestic security arrangements was moving on to its next phase. First came the long and involved process of slimming down the Empire's 8 legions into 6. This had reportedly raised all sorts of issues on the Empire's side, as such a monumental change had massive economic and demographic repercussions. Officially, they had acquiesced to the Sorceress Kingdom's advisory, but Lian said that the Empire's administration was working like hell in order to mitigate disruptions caused by the dissolution of 2 whole legions. This paved the way for supplementary forces from the Sorceress Kingdom to assume their posts in the Baharuth Empire. The Empire's protectorate status allowed it a nearly unlimited degree of freedom when it came to all aspects of its governance, so these supplementary forces were simply leased out to be used by the Imperial Army. One might say that it was a forced lease, but, at the same time, the leased forces were far superior even when compared to the combined might of the 2 dissolved legions while being a fraction of the operating cost. What was left now was the integration of these leased forces with the Imperial Army. The Grand Marshal and his general staff had come up with several recommendations for the Empire, but the Empire was ultimately allowed to do as they saw fit. Invoking the overruling clause in their relationship as suzerain and client state was not something to be done lightly, after all. Instead, Lord Cocytus had opted to send a liaison to advise the Imperial Army on the deployment of their new security forces. As the Baharuth Empire was a human one, he had decided to ask Ludmilla if she would serve in the role as one with ample experience commanding the Royal Army. It would be a long trip, but winter was a slower season for humans in rural territories as it was for demi-human tribes. Her winter schedule was equally slow and uneventful, mostly overseeing the ongoing development efforts that would proceed regardless of whether she was there or not. She had meant to fill that time with her work in the upper reaches, but that task had been unexpectedly catapulted forward as well. What remained was her work in the sparsely populated remainder of the upper reaches and her ongoing research for the development of Warden's Vale. Taking on a role as an army liaison was the perfect opportunity to learn about the Empire, presented at as close to a perfect time as possible. It was as if everything had been preordained, though she couldn't begin to imagine what sort of masterful architect could have engineered the flow of events in such a purposeful way. That being said, she would be a fool if she let such a golden opportunity slip by. A first-hand look at the Imperial legions was exactly what she needed. Ludmilla went over to her desk and settled down to pen out a reply,